Viewers of the channel may be aware of the series dealing with my trip to South Africa, which I was fortunate enough to undertake in 2019, what seems like a lifetime ago. Part of this series, which is far from complete, has been a discussion surrounding the Battle of Isandlwana, fought on the 22nd of January 1879. There have been some 4 videos already published focusing on this important event. As alluded to in my last video, it has been my intent to speak to some of the detailed aspects of this battle as they pertain to specific realities and what we might call myths. Part of the draw of this battle is a certain degree of speculation resulting from the considerable vacuum of knowledge surrounding large parts of the fighting. This is due to the unfortunate loss of so many men on that horrible day. We simply don't have the detailed accounts that we might otherwise enjoy. So many of the British soldiers were killed, and so many of the Zulus who didn't rely on the written word survived to have their stories recorded for posterity. Initially, I was going to attempt to cover these myths and legends myself, but much to your relief, I'm sure, we are most excited to be able to break new ground here on British Muzzleloaders and bring to the channel a very special guest, one who is eminently more qualified than I to address the misconceptions, myths, and even lies that surround this well-known and fascinating Victorian battle. The conversation presented here totaled nearly 4 hours in length, perhaps testimony to the depth of knowledge of our guest, but also to his unsurpassable patience in answering the considerable list of questions brought to the table. For that, I am deeply grateful. For you, the viewer, I've made the decision to break up the presentation into segments of about 1 hour in length. I've tried to add maps and diagrams to support the dialogue and give context to the greater discussion. That said, this is not a blow-by-blow account of the battle. For that, may I direct you to the 4-part presentation on the channel previously published. In this, part 1 of the presentation, we'll discuss Zulu Tactics, the Zulu Plan and its execution, early sightings of elements of the Zulu Army, and details surrounding the discovery of its main body. I hope you enjoy what I found to be a most interesting and engaging conversation with one of today's most well-known and insightful experts on Victorian warfare and the Battle of Isandlwana in particular. Our guest is a Monmouthshire man who was commissioned into the Royal Regiment of Wales in 1984. In the subsequent 30 years of professional soldiering, 10 of which were on active service, he held numerous regimental and extra-regimental positions. He was 3 times a company commander, twice with his own battalion, and once on secondment to the Cheshire Regiment. He was second in command of the Royal Regiment of Wales battle group in Bosnia, and held numerous staff positions in the UK, on operations in Northern Ireland, Afghanistan, the Sudan, and South Africa. He was awarded the MBE in 2000 by the Queen for his work in anti-terrorism, and his service in the Sudan led to successful termination of local tribal conflicts. He left the military in 2013 and successfully pursued a PhD in military history under the late Professor Richard Holmes and Professor Peter Caddick-Adams. He has written 7 well-regarded books on Victorian military history, including one on the battle we will be discussing here. He has also taken up the proprietorship of Iron Duke Miniatures, manufacturing high-quality military miniatures for the tabletop wargaming community. For further details on his impressive and extensive biography, please refer to the description below. We have a very special guest today in Col Mike Snook MBE, PhD. Sir, welcome to the channel.
Thank you, Rob. Nice to be with you.
It's a great pleasure to have you here. It's the first time that we've ever done something like this on British Muzzleloaders. And well, I can't think of a better and more appropriate guest, especially in the light of our South Africa series, to have on the channel. So it's been a bit of a road to get here, but I certainly appreciate your time and your effort in having this discussion with us today.
My pleasure.
We've prepared a sort of a list of questions, if you will, and these questions relate to, how should we say, so certain myths or maybe misconceptions is perhaps a better word to put to it, about the Battle of Isandlwana in particular. There's a lot of things that regard perhaps Zulu methods. There's some of those standout myths that seem to pop up all the time, especially on the internet, regarding ammunition
and lack of supply, this kind of thing, jamming rifles. And there is a certain degree of revisionism that goes on, as I'm sure you're well aware, with sort of the coulda, shoulda, woulda, to put a sort of a casual phrase to that. You know, should have done this better, should have deployed this way, should have fought the battle in certain ways. And so these are some of the aspects that I thought that we might, gain some value of your insight towards and present those to the audience. I guess, sort of without further ado, I thought that if we started with perhaps some aspects of the Zulu Army and work our way sort of from that, because that ties into the greater deployment of the Zulu Army, and then we'll sort of work our way through the story and get to perhaps more focused points towards the end. Does that sound okay to you?
Sounds very good to me, because I think the Zulus have to be the start point. It's their big battle. It's classic vindication of their tactics, and so I think that's a very good start point, because so much flows from it.
Right. Many people's visualization of Zulu tactics sort of comes from movies and other live reenactments, or even perhaps some documentaries. But there's a propensity to believe that the Zulus, sort of they maneuvered in great masses with very little tactical nuance. So I was wondering, how does this popular conception sort of the Zulu maneuver and fighting methods compare, sort of to the reality of the way they fought their battles, in particular this one?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the first things to say is that we must all put the idea of a solid phalanx of warriors out of our mind. These are not Greek hoplites. They are not close order troops. So the Zulus move in very large numbers, but they do so in skirmish formations. So they're an interesting amalgam of both mass and the tactics of the light infantrymen. So, but if we sort of go up to the operational level and think of their way of doing business, as everybody knows, we talk about the horns of the buffalo formation: the left horn, a right horn, a reserve, and then the chest. And that is often attributed to Shaka. This is a Shakan innovation, the African Napoleon, as it were. But in fact, that sort of 4-division way of doing business is pretty eternal in military history. A left wing, a right wing, a reserve, and a centre. There's nothing particularly novel about that. And indeed, that the same was true in Africa. If you look at the Amakosa, for example, in the period prior to the sort of the Cape Frontier Wars, or the classic period of the Cape Frontier Wars from the 1830s, 40s onwards, you'll find that a Xhosa army would similarly form up with a left horn, a right horn, and 2 groups of warriors in the middle. My Xhosa is going to fail me, but I can recall that the reserve guys, the guys that were in the centre, were called the Amafenkosi, who were the men who, it translates as the men who fight with the king. So, you get that idea of the sort of senior warriors in the centre and somebody else on the wings. Well, if the senior guys are in the centre, who's on the wings? It's the younger guys, which is exactly the way the Zulu did it. But of course, the Zulu were doing something different as well. And this is the post-Shakan innovation, is that they were using speed, shock action, simultaneity, all these great sort of modern maneuver warfare cries that we talk about today, but they're actually transposed back into a 19th century African army. They did all these things. So scale is a word we must, I think, come to terms with. So when this attack at Isandlwana develops, is across a 5-mile frontage, 5 miles of frontage, and that is certainly not something that the British are thinking about in advance of the big event. So scale is something. Speed is another aspect of it. The idea of the horns not merely pushing out to the flanks, but pushing deep and wide to the flanks with the purpose of achieving the classic military maneuver double envelopment. It's known. And then the sort of simultaneity and the psychological aspect of it, and it's all happening together, and it's all happening very rapidly, so that the enemy is sort of caught in the headlights somewhat. Like, there's enemy over there, that might be the left horn. There's enemy over there, it's actually the right horn. But by the time the guy caught in the headlights has worked this out, it's all going a little bit, probably a little bit pear-shaped for him. You know, it's all happening too quickly, too suddenly, there's too much going on, and he's not entirely quite certain what he's dealing with. So that whole sort of simultaneity thing, based on a simple standard operating procedure, SOP as we call it, of a battle drill going into the battle in a certain fixed way. That has the advantage that everybody on the Zulu side knows exactly what they're on, because they've rehearsed it before, they've done it before, they know what's expected. But and therefore that it can be done very quickly with this unsettling psychological effect on the enemy who's not quite sure, especially if it's the beginning of a new war, as is the case in January 1879. If the opposition has not fought you in that manner before, then it can have a very unsettling effect. And I think that's what we've seen at Isandlwana. So not phalanxes, but fast-moving, big bodies of warriors, moving in columns, but again, not in a French Napoleonic style column, a column of skirmishers shooting off into the distance, knowing where it's going, why it's going there, and what it's going to do when it gets there. And as I say, the important thing really is to appreciate that this is a standard operating procedure. So this is how it happens. This is how it's done in the Zulu army. They know that, and that's what they execute really to perfection at Isandlwana.
So we talk a little bit of you alluded to sort of the SOP nature of the Zulu battle plan. I guess there's some speculation exists in believing that the overall Zulu battle plan included a sort of a deliberate series of actions that was intended to force the British forces to split into smaller groups and thereby make them by nature easier to attack and defeat sort of in piecemeal fashion. And I was just wondering if there is any evidence to suggest that this was part of their plan, and then sort of to follow on. And if this was not the case, then were the Zulus at the Mangeni? What were they doing there?
Okay, I'm glad you mentioned Mangeni there, because I think, the points I've already made about the execution of the main Zulu attack, it must also be said that it's not sophisticated. It is what it is, and it's not that adaptable. So it's a one-shot option. So in terms of breaking the British up, at a tactical level, that comes later. But at this business of at the operational level, is there an attempt to lure Lord Chelmsford to the wrong part of the battle space? Well, the short answer to that is no. Certainly not if you believe that the battle is to be fought on the 23rd of January, that is to say the day after. Then all that activity out there at Mangeni is in the wrong part of time and space. I must correct myself, sorry. If you believe the battle is to be fought on the 22nd, then it's in the wrong part of time and space. It's only if it's going to be on the 23rd, the day after, that it sort of slots into place. Okay, and I'll pad that out with a bit more detail. But I think this is an important point. If you subscribe to the idea, as some do, that the battle was always going to take place on the 22nd of January, then there isn't enough time and space for an act of deception to occur. Now, the Zulu army is moving into position in the Ingwebeni Valley in the dark on the evening of the 21st. the evening before the battle. So if in your postulation the Zulus are going to immediately attack the first night on the 22nd, then what's going on at Manganey doesn't work as an act of deception. So let's roll back a bit and think about what has gone on before that point, because we're describing this scenario where the Zulus suddenly pop up at Manganey towards darkness on the evening of the 21st. So let's roll back from that. In daytime on the 21st, Lord Chelmsford sends a very large part of his force out in that direction anyway. The so-called Lonsdale-Dartmoor reconnaissance, which consists of two pretty much full NNC battalions, over the 3rd Regiment NNC, plus a significant number of mounted men, up around 120 men under Major Dartmoor. Now, they all troop off very early on the morning of the 21st, and they're out all day. So the Manganey, nothing the Zulus have done has triggered Lord Chelmsford's interest in Manganey. It pre-exists. It is part of his understanding of the situation. And the reason that is so is that there is this enormous swathe of difficult and dead ground off to the half right of the British axis of advance. So they're heading straight across the plain towards Spacey Hill. That's where they'll end up. But across to the half right, there is this area at Manganey, and it's completely dead ground to the plain on which Isandlwana is located because of the High Malakata feature, which runs eventually into the Tlazakazi feature. So everything behind that is in dead ground to the British at this number one. It's an enormous space. On top of that, Chelmsford is getting sort of an intelligence feed from a guy called Henry Finn, who's the magistrate just across the river on the Natal side at Umsinga, a place called Umsinga. And he's convinced himself that actually the Zulu army is going to cross the river in that dead ground through the Kudeli forest area to ravage the Umsinga magistracy and other parts further downriver from where Lord Chelmsford is. And that's all very interesting, but it doesn't happen to be true. At no point has it been part of the Zulu battle plan. But Chelmsford is getting this feed from their old Finn. And it pre-establishes in his mind this belief that the Zulus are going to be off to his half right, and that he'd better do something about having a lookout in that direction. And that's what the Dartmoor-Lonsdale reconnaissance is all about. And off they go, and they're out all day on the 21st. Now, there are Zulus out in that direction, and that's the followers of Chief Matiana or Matshana, depending on which route you wish to go down. And the intelligence estimates of that time, and they seem to be broadly accurate, is that Matshana could put about 400 to 500 warriors out if he put his mind to it. And there are contacts during the course of the day that fit with that sort of scenario. I mean, they're minor contacts. There's no determined opposition on the part of the Zulus. They're brushes, really. But it's not drawing the British anywhere because they're always going to where they're going to, which is they're going to end up at the Manganey area, at the top end of the Manganey gorge. You know, that's a predetermined outcome. Towards sunset, then. Sorry, let me just backtrack slightly. Dartnell decides towards, as day is wearing on, that the Zulus have gone firm in a position on the Findo Hills in such a way that he will be able to attack them in the morning with his largely colonial command, no regular troops with him. So, as the day is winding towards a close, the two ADCs from Lord Chelmsford's staff, Glossop and Buller, are going to ride back to camp anyway, to sort of presumably retire to their tents for the night, whilst Dartnell and his people sort of rough it in the field. And so they agree to brief Lord Chancellor to the effect that Dartmoor has changed his plan, or changed the overall plan, in that he is not going to return to camp for the colonial route. He's going to attack this body of Matt Shannon's followers in the morning. And that's all is well in that regard. Gossip and Buller head off, and they find Lord Chelmsford riding back into camp from another reconnaissance that he himself is doing, out actually in the direction, the true direction of enemy threat. And they apprise Chelmsford of Dartmoor's intention to stay out overnight. Chelmsford is not particularly fazed by that. It's not what he had ordered, but at least somebody's had the courtesy to tell him, and does nothing about it. But of course, nobody's got any rations out of Mountgate, so a plan has been hatched whereby a guy called Walsh, who's an officer in the mounted infantry squadron, will go out with a few pack animals laden with biscuits and what have you to feed the European officers and NCOs of the NNC out at Mountgate. So Walsh will leave the camp of Isandlwana with these supplies at some point during the late afternoon. Meanwhile, the situation has suddenly changed at Mountgate when Dartmoor, in his anxiety to maintain contact with the enemy, because it's a principle of reconnaissance that once you have made reconnaissance contact, you don't lose it, you don't break it again, because otherwise you have to perform the entire find function all over again, back to the drawing board. So you don't lose contact with the enemy in that way. So the last thing he does before this sort of pitch black African night descends on the landscape is to send a guy called Inspector Mansell up onto a ridge to see where the Zulus have gone. And before he heads off with a small mounted patrol, before he gets to the top of that ridge, he's suddenly confronted by the estimate is between 1,500 and 2,000 Zulus, which I think the war correspondent Horace Newman says it's 2,000. Most of the other estimates are down around the 1,000, 1,500. But it isn't 400 to 500, so it's not Matt Shannon. The situation has changed, as they like to say in the military. And Inspector Mansell and his team are sort of chased back downhill by this major force of Zulus, which is throwing out left and right wings as it comes downhill. This is not Matt Shannon's local force, this is something different. So there's quite a lot of alarm and consternation now. There always has been from the moment Dartmoor has decided this must stay out overnight. Quite a lot of the NNC officers are unsettled by that. They're not really up for overnighting in enemy territory with sort of rather shaky NNC troops and nothing much else. So when this new development happens, they become decidedly anxious. But of course, what can they do? Now it's pitch black. They can't get back to this anymore. They've got to sort of bluff it out and overnight that. And Dartmoor decides that, well, he can't really continue to attack such a large force with the disposable assets he has available to him. So when Walsh arrives with the biscuits, with the mules with the biscuits, the hardtack biscuits, he asks Walsh, look, will you please go back to Isandlwana, which was a bit of a short straw. The guy had just got across the plain toward the very last of the light, and now it's pitch black. Now he wants him to go back again and say to Lord Chelmsford, look, I can only proceed with my attack in the morning if you send me some regular troops, because there is this much larger body of Zulus now out in this part of the world. Walsh makes that ride back across the plain, a brave thing to do, pitch black, 12 miles. And he makes it back to camp at about 1 o'clock in the morning. By the time they've all fussed around, gone through the vedettes and the sentries, and he makes the report to Major Clery, who's Colonel Glynn's chief of staff. Colonel Glynn says, you better take it to the general. And then Clery goes to Lord Chelmsford and explains the new situation, that there is this much larger force of Zulus out in that direction, and that Dartmoor wants reinforcement. And then that leads to what I call the Capcom Decision. The Lord Chancellor sat on the edge of his camp cot and said, right, okay, we're going to send the entire 2nd Battalion of 24, 4 of the 6 guns, and the mounted infantry out to support Dartmoor's operations in the morning. We'll march at 4 a.m. Now, that Capcom decision is improbable. It's something that is very circumstance dependent and could not have been built into any higher deception plan on the part of the Zulus. Now, if you want the troops to be out there on the 22nd, the day of your battle, then you have to demonstrate around about midday on the 21st, which will give them all the afternoon needed to get out there, thus to be in the wrong place when the attack comes on the 22nd. But it doesn't happen that way. It only happens right at the closing of the day, just as the sun's going down, and it's too late for it to fit with that deliberate attack on the 22nd postulation, leaving aside all the other factors that rule that out. So no, that is not an act of deception or decoy. It is an act. If we look at exactly what Chinwaya, the Zulu command was doing at that time, is he's moving his army across the front of Lord Chancellor's force, from his right front to his left front, to end up in the Ingrabane Valley, where Chinwaya intends to end overnight, moving across his front. And then this arrival of 1,500 to 2,000 warriors at Mangani is a divergence from that line of march back to Ingrabane. So it is a flank screening deployment. In other words, they know that Lord Chancellor, or not Lord Chancellor, but they know that the British are at Mangani in some considerable numbers. Obviously their intelligence network, their patrols, their scouting was joined up enough to tell them that there are British at Mangani. But Chinwaya's intent is to get across the plain before it gets pitch black. He's got to get a move on because he needs to get into the Ingrabane Valley. He needs to get there, and he doesn't want to be interrupted by the British sort of shoving into his left flank in any way, shape, or form. So, to my mind, that deployment of that regiment, I think it sounds like one regiment, is something that he throws out to his left flank to shield his move across through the Zindo Hills and Spacey and into the Ingrabane Valley before last night. I think I've said enough on that, Rob.
Well,
that's how I interpret it.
Sure, but the fact that this is the way that you do interpret it, I mean, that makes complete military sense. If you're crossing an obstacle, if you will, from moving from hills or through hills and then crossing a bit of a plain to get to another set of hills where you're going to lie up, then it stands to reason that you'd put somebody on the flank there to guard that evolution, that if somebody does bump into you while you're in the middle of this, at least you've got somebody sort of firm, ready to react, rather than the main part of your army all strung out and in some sort of transit from A to B. I mean, that's that. In my limited military mind, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, he doesn't want to be seen. He doesn't want to be interrupted, and he doesn't want to be seen. And it's no coincidence that Mansell is driven back before he gets to the top of the hill, because from the top of the hill, he will see what he's not meant to see.
Right.
And that seems to me is what it's all about.
Right.
It's blinding the British. It's not decoying the British.
Right. So we've discussed sort of what the Zulus were doing at the Mangeni and the relationship between the greater the British forces and them in terms of the movement between. But if we jump ahead slightly, there were a number of sightings of large bodies of Zulus above the Inyoni Ridge at various points throughout the morning on the 22nd, before the main attack was launched. And some of these circumstances, I guess, seem to go against sort of conventional sort of military tactical thinking. in the sense of perhaps exposing themselves needlessly and that kind of thing. So if the main attack didn't develop until later in the day, then why was there so much movement above the escarpment so early on?
Yeah, this has been made into, and indeed is, a $40,000 question, as it were. So I think we ought usefully to look at the question of the timing of the battle, and of course there is a primary witness on this, and I'll just read what Mehloka Zulu says about it, because so much more flows from it. Now, attempts are made to rubbish this testimony, but it's perfectly emphatic. He's a person of significance and very clear in what he says. We slept the night before the battle in a valley rising from the Neutral Range and running eastwards towards the King's Cotton, and we all know that's the Ingubeni Valley. It abounds with scrubby bush and small stones. We did not see Lord Chelmsford's army leave the camp on the day of the battle, 22nd, but heard the report of firearms and saw him returning, and we know that's towards sunset. No orders were given as to the attack. It was not our day. Quite emphatic. Our day was the following day, even more emphatic. It being the new moon, we did not intend to fight. Our intention was to attack the camp the next day at dawn, but the English forces came to attack us first. Now, you can spend as much time as you like rubbishing that, saying that it's come through translation or through some jaundiced English interpreter, but that's not the way history works. That's a primary statement from a not insignificant player. He's only a junior officer in the Zulu army, but tribally he's an important player. So, therefore, but there is this movement on the 22nd that you've alluded to that sort of puts the cat amongst the pigeons in terms of Mehloka Zulu's testimony. Essentially, that activity comes in two bouts. It comes at 7:30 and it comes at 9:30 on the 22nd. Now, the first lot of activity at 7:30 in the morning, we know triggers what is known as the first alarm, where the troops are put under arms at something just shy of 8 o'clock. And we know at 8:05 a.m., Colonel Pillane signs off on his message to Lord Chelmsford to say that the enemy are advancing in force from the left front of camp. And he uses that unfortunate in force phrase, which could mean 100 different things. What does in force mean? Does it mean 600? Does it mean 6,000? Does it mean 20,000? So loose terminology there that doesn't help Chelmsford's understanding of the situation when that message is eventually received for the bags. In fact, the time is on the bottom. Time of receipt is on the bottom. I actually handled that document, the bit of blue notepaper that Pillane wrote on. We have it in the Regimental Museum at Brecon. It was kept in the possession of Alan Parr, the staff officer, who signed for it. So, but I cannot immediately remember what that time was, 9 something or other. So about an hour later, something more than an hour later. Mm-hmm. But that 7:30 activity leads to the first stand to in the camp, at which juncture Pillane does nothing except keep his troops formed on parade, which is in accordance with his orders, act strictly on the defensive. So he does nothing. He waits hard in, concentrating on the camp first for the situation with developments. And why are the Zulus moving around at 7:30? It's clearly not all of them, because you can't move 25,000 men around. The cat is not let out of the bag, as it were. It was, but it was at least several thousand, because we have the testimony from the vedettes Natal Carboneers who posted on two outlying lookout positions in the Yetsi Hill and Quabi Hill. One of them, certainly, I forget the name of a particular trooper, talks about thousands of Zulus, which is where Bling will get this idea of in force from. So there's certainly something significant going on. And he says that they're seen moving above the escarpment. Well, from when you have to think of the ground to the north of the camp, the northeast of the camp, that is to say, to the left of the British tents up on the high ground, divides into what I call the lower plateau. That is to say, it's not the Nutru Plateau proper, which is higher again, but there's a lower plateau. And the Ingwebeni Valley in which the Zulu army is hidden is beyond the edge, beyond the end of that lower plateau. But behind both the lower plateau and the Ingwebeni Valley is the Ingedla Heights, which is the sort of edge of the Nutru Plateau proper. So from those positions on Quabe Hill and in Yetsi Hill, they wouldn't be able to see any movement in the Ingwebeni area unless it was in a more elevated direction. That is to say, unless it was movement on the Ingedla Heights. Because then you can imagine you've got columns of Zulus broken out of the Ingwebeni Valley, they're going uphill to the Ingedla Heights. So who would be moving in that direction? Well, it's not the left horn, because that's diametrically the opposite. It's not the chest and the reserve, it's the right horn. And so it seems pretty clear to me that there is a preliminary move takes place. And really, this is 7:30 in the morning. This is the first opportunity that Jonglei has had to attend to the real estate management of his army. They got into the valley in the dark, pitch black, can't do anything useful at that time. By the time they mill around a bit, after sun up in the morning, and then get mustered, get organised, get briefed, then I think we're talking about the right horn moving out of the Ingwebeni Valley to somewhere else. Now, I can't take you to where that somewhere else is, but I do know it's not the Ingwebeni Valley, because the distance from the Ingwebeni Valley to where the right horn will play its role the following day in attacking the rear of the camp, certain parts of it attack the rear of the camp, is some great distance of something like 14 or 15 kilometres. And that doesn't fit in time and space with the move of the left horn. Those sort of contacts with the left horn and the right horn have broadly the same sort of time when the main battle proper opens at noon. Both sides come into contact at roughly the same time. It's not possible that the right horn can magically cover 14 kilometres. So they have to have been somewhere further forward than that in order for the sort of simultaneity of contact on the two flanks to take place. So to my mind, Jonglei has moved his right horn out of the Ingwebeni Valley, which is it's a big piece of real estate, but it's orientated wrong to his direction of attack, in that it's end on. And of course, he wants to be able to move his entire army out that way, not through the end of the valley. So, in order to have enough real estate to get all his ducks in a row, he has to get some part of the army to some other part of the battle space in order to do this great big manoeuvre that we've talked about, this 5-mile manoeuvre, a 5-mile frontage run. So, in order to achieve that, he's got to have stuff out to the right and stuff out to the left. So that 7:30 movement, to my mind, is the right horn being sent out to take up a place of concealment somewhere other than the Ingwebeni Valley and above the Ingedla Heights. And once you've broken the skyline and got beyond the edge of the Ingedla Heights, you've got pretty much freedom of manoeuvre. There's nothing There is no part of the British picket line that will protect you. So once you're up there, beyond the heights, you're in completely dead ground. You can go anywhere. That's why I can't point to you where the right horn actually was positioned. The other interesting thing is, of all the Zulu accounts we have, I have yet to come up or come upon one that comes from somebody who was in the right horn regiment. So in terms of sourcing, that's a huge gap. There's nobody with the right form to sort of rule things in and out. So we're really, to a certain extent, left with speculation only if we trust this time and space factor. But it can't be, that way, because the simultaneity it did not come 14 kilometres at the same time as the rest of the army was coming a much shorter distance. So that's what I think goes on at 7:30, and that's why nothing happens. There's this movement of several thousand warriors cited by Trooper, what's his name, from one of the outlying hills, but then nothing happens until the 9:30 set to, and again something happens then. So what is that all about? Well, I'll give you another little reading, if I may, from an unnamed warrior of the Cheshire Regiment. And this is what I've called the false start, if you will, false start to the attack. So here we are, a warrior of the Cheshire Regiment. We were sitting resting when firing was heard on our left, which we at first imagined was the improper Makosi engaged. That's a regiment of left horn. That's why he thinks it's there. The Cheshire being in the centre. And we armed and ran forward in the direction of the sound. We were soon told, however, that it was the white troops fighting with Matshana's people some 10 miles away to our left front, and returned to our original position. So at 9:30 you get this false alarm, and it completely dovetails with the evidence we have from the British at Mangani. Eventually, Lord Chelmsford has arrived there as a result of the Capcom Decision. He's out there with half his regular troops, and he can't find this significant Zulu force that Dartmouth saw the night before. Everybody's sort of desperate with frustration, and now they're not there. And they're not there. They're definitely not there because they've moved off and they've rejoined the main army in the remaining part, either first thing in the morning or even during the darkness hours. If they did that, then they left some fires burning to reflect the fact that they'd gone. But they weren't there to be found the following morning. But Matshana's people still are there, and this group of 400, 500, and eventually the British find them. They find a few of them, a concentration of them, which they line up to attack. And at 9:30, you get this fairly heavy outbreak of firing, in which both the NNC battalions certainly are in action. I think some of the 2nd and 4th companies also. My memory fades, but that's if I was there. Sorry, my memory of the history fades. But there is this outbreak of fighting at 9:30, and there's a bit, you can stand on the Mabasso Ridge, which looks down into the Valley. Look to your right, and you will see the Mangani area. It's in plain view. And the distance, I don't know, maybe 6, 7 miles, something like that, with a bleak angle. It's certainly very easy for an outbreak firing, the sound of that outbreak firing, to carry to the Ravani Valley, exactly as described by the unknown warrior of Cheshire. So what then happens is that you get this forward movement at 9:30 by parts of the main infantry in the belief that the battle has started. What's all that shooting? Right, here we go, SOPs. We execute the drill because that's what we do. So off they go. Now, we've got our friend Captain Barry on picket duty on the Quainey Hill, on the feature on the lower plateau, looking out to the northeast. And he sees, this was reported today, the Zulus advancing in 3 columns. And when this report eventually comes in, it includes the rider that 2 of those columns have retired. So we go back to what our friend in the Mkhitaryan said. We went back from whence we came, as he says. Well, that movement seen by Barry, 3 columns, 3 regiments in the right horn, 2 of which turned back from whence they came, a place that I can't point you to, I don't know where it is, but it's somewhere out, not to the northeast, but more directly north, whence they could have come, perhaps about 3 or 4 kilometres, not 14 kilometres, to come into action. So 2 of them have gone back again, 1 hasn't. Why is that? Well, if you imagine 3 regiments of rifle advancing towards McQueen Hill, pretty much, it would be pretty easy for 2 of them to be to one side of it. It's a big feature, about a kilometre long, and 1 to be to the other side of it. That's the way 3 divides, 2 and 1, left and right. And so that's how you end up with 1 regiment doing something completely different to the other 2. The other 2, went back from where they came. The other one is seen, of course, by John Chard, the Royal Engineer from Monmouthshire, who's been slightly bemused by his orders. It's not clear whether he is personally required to report to the camp at Isandlwana, or whether the column staff simply want his detachment of 4 or 5 Royal Engineers. So he's in the camp between roughly 9 o'clock and 9:45, very conveniently, because that, of course, is the time of the false alarm. He sees a very large body of Zulus. One of the ensues gives him a telescope to watch the Zulus, and he says, in fact, they disappear out of view behind the lion cock of Isandlwana. That's pretty much an unmistakable description of Isandlwana mountain itself. So he is seeing somebody moving along the Tarwani spur and then disappearing on the other side. He thinks, hey ho, and there's danger that these boys are going to have us go at raw drift. I'd better get back there where I belong. And so off he goes. And he takes the lead of the camp, but he has left with survivors. Invaluable piece of testimony. There was movement along the Tarwani spur. So my contention to you is that the Mkhitaryan go off in the centre, rough area of the main line-up position. The linkage between the right horn and the centre will be visual. So somebody who's specifically posted to keep an eye on things by the command of the right horn. So, reports that the Mkhitaryan are attacking in the centre. So the Ndunas, of the right horn, think, oh, hey, we are executing the SOP, the drill, this is it. They go off as well. At some point, they look to their left, they realise that there isn't a chest there isn't a centre, there isn't an attack going on. So they twig that something has gone awry, and they turn back from whence they came. One regiment can't see what they can see because they're on the blind side of the plane. So they continue to wheel to their right towards the Tarwani spur. They're seen from the camp, not just by Chard, but obviously everybody in the camp. And then when they realise that actually there's nobody else here on the outside, they wheel away into the Manzinyama Valley, the approaches to the Manzinyama Valley, Manzinyama stream, which would eventually show its way around behind this environment. There, in some separate hideout position for the rest of the morning, while meant to develop. That's what I put to you. That's how, having looked at this time and time again over a very long period of time, how do you make some sort of sense of these apparently curious sightings? Well, they work in that way. And what I've done in reconstructing what I've just put to you is to take all the sort of fixed pieces of information that we know from primary sources like Chard, like the Warrior in Kedro and the rest of it, bang those into the ground like pegs. And then in between those pegs is the possible ways to arrive at the outcome. Once you've worked your way through all the pegs banged into the ground to the outcome, what I've just explained to you, what you're left with, I don't see any other explanation that covers that sort of set of goings on at 7:30 and 9:30, as well as that. I mean, I could be entirely wrong, but nobody's yet proved it. Nobody really yet has alternative postulations apart from the, oh, well, they were always attacking from first light. Just doesn't work.
So would it then sort of suffice to sum up that what the forces that Chard saw in the morning was a fallout, if you will, of this false start?
Yes.
And the confusion that relates to, numbers of different groupings of Zulus who are moving to execute a plan they think has been initiated, and getting to a point at varying points within that execution before realizing that we're not actually executing it.
Yeah.
And that's why perhaps then that the troops that Chard sees, and as you mentioned, surely everybody else in his location saw as well, were elements of this of the right wing that were ready to go and sort of getting to the edge of a hill and realizing, oh, wait a minute, we're not actually attacking yet. Yeah. And turning around and diverting to say, oh, look, we better just find a safe spot here until we know for sure that we're going to attack.
It's the only possible explanation. They have to be the right horn. Yeah. Or parts of the right horn. They can't be anywhere else. They can't be the left horn. They can't be any other part of the horn. It's got to be the right horn. And where do they go? Well, they can only go into the Manzinyama Valley because that's in dead ground away from the Tar armies, but that had the British outposts on the field. So where do they end up? Well, there's only one place they can end up. Who are they? They can only be one group of warriors. I think it's quite difficult to gainsay that set of deductions, if you will.
I think one aspect of this that's interesting to me is that where you're examining, nothing ever goes completely to plan. And what we're seeing unfold here is a mistake or a misunderstanding and actions resulting from that. But then the attempt to recapture and get ourselves back on a footing where we can take that breath and then launch the attack proper. And the mitigation of those mistakes is as important as fighting a battle, I would expect, as is the plan itself.
They have to reset because of this business. The attack being a drill,
right? A
one-shot option. If it backfires, you've got to roll back and do it again, start again.
Right.
It's all they can do because that's the way they attack. Left horn, right horn, chest, reserve moving behind. That's what they do. So if it's all gone off at half cock, which we know playing with planes, then all you can do is roll back to where you started from. Right, okay, we'll have another go. And that's what happens at around this time.
Right. So we've discussed some of the sort of the preliminary movements, if you will, of the Zulu, the army, both from and around the Mangeni, and then closer to the area of the battle proper, in terms of the movements above the Inyoni Ridge. But this sort of brings and leads us into the phase of the action where the Zulu army is discovered, for lack of a better term. And launched by Durnford, elements of the Natal native mounted contingent, were sent to probe forward and find, or I guess in Durnford's way, he wanted to fight the Zulus on a number of axes. Or axes, I should say. On the northern flank above the escarpment, there are two troops under Raw and Roberts, are generally associated with the first elements of these probes bumping into the main Zulu army, with Raw arriving on the crest of a ridge overlooking the Zulu camp in the Ngumbeni. I guess there are some stories or some storylines or some theories that speak to I guess a slightly different way that the Zulu army was discovered, rather than having them being surprised by this troop of Natal native mounted contingent at the precipice of the valley and looking down into them. So is it still safe to assume that the sort of conventional aspect or the conventional take on the way the Zulu army was discovered, is that still a safe assumption to make, that the Natal native mounted contingent arrived at the edge of this valley overlooking the vast majority of the Zulu army, engaged them briefly, and this is what really sort of sparked the army into action and began, forcibly, mind you, because of a compromise, the battle in general? Is it still safe to assume that?
Yes, well, I mean, attempts to disprove that postulation really stretch the domains of history or the practice of history. So in order to do it, you have to pick up on individual words and in the limited array of primary source accounts that we have, and stretch that word to mean precisely what you, as the alternative historian, wants it to mean. But the general drift of the history is perfectly clear. And there is an event at 9:30, the false start, and then the battle proper opens at about midday. Those are pegs in the ground. You can't argue with that.
Right.
So if you want to fiddle around with to move one of the pegs, which I really don't allow myself to do, a peg is a peg, then you have to play this game where you're putting fairly far-fetched interpretations upon or your particular interpretation, which you might look at, Rob, and I might look at, and I don't agree with what he's saying. I mean, that does not follow at all. He's really picked up on this word. For example, hill. What is a hill? Well, if you do any amount of military history, you'll know full well that one soldier will call a hill a mountain, another one will call it a tump or a hillock or a kopje, or it's in the language. So you can't particularly pick up on a single word and say he said hill, so he can't mean ridge. No, that's not the way history works. So if we go back to the pegs firmly knocked in, you've got the 9:30 false start and the 12 o'clock main event. Now, that main event occurs because Durnford has essayed out of the camp on two fronts. There's got numbers 1 and 2 troops above the escarpment, and numbers the Edendale and the Ziccardi below the escarpment, under his own command. One will make contact with the Zulu chest, one will make contact with the left horn as it emerges from in the Vale Valley around the back door, as it were. It happens at midday. Now, I think there's room to debate how far towards the Mabasso Ridge Raw and Roberts had actually got by the time they made contact. In other words, were the Zulus moving forward slightly before that point? Because they heard firing, for example. Because there was one of the things we do know is that Raw and Roberts were chasing herd boys with cattle. And these have been, it's clearly not the local lads, these have been sent out by the Impi. They are the Doobie boys accompanied the army, as you know, to with sleeping mats, a limited amount of ration, the rest of it, and just along for the fun, basically. So that tells us that is a pointer towards the fact that the battle was not to be fought on the 23rd, because the Zulus are thinking about feeding themselves. And why are they rounding up cattle? They're rounding up cattle because there are 25,000 of them, and they haven't fed since the day before. So they will want some quantity of cattle to feed on at some point during the day on the 22nd, because they're waiting for the 23rd. So there is shooting associated with the pursuit of the cattle boys by Raw and Roberts, and that might conceivably bring some forward movement at an earlier point than Raw himself, or I think it's probably something Raw. Certainly in Donald Morris's book, there's a sort of great descriptive passage of Raw riding up right onto the edge of Mombasa Ridge and looking down into the Valley of the Shields, as they call it in Romania, and seeing the infantry there. Well, fine. I mean, Raw might not have got all the way to the top of the ridge and looked down into the valley, but if he didn't, then he was within a couple of hundred yards of it, and the Zulus are coming the other way, sort of thing. So it's 6 of one, half to the other in many ways. But the point is that the battle was initiated at around about midday because of Durford's advance with mounted troops on both fronts. It was a pressing advance. It was designed to press, designed to make contact, and surprise, surprise, it did make contact. To gainsay that, you really have to tug hard at the history in all sorts of improbable ways. Like I say, he might not have been right on top of the Mombasa Ridge. Perhaps some of his men were. Captain Shepstone was out there. George Shepstone, Commissary Hamer, who should have been with his ammunition wagons, of course, but that's another story. They probably didn't get to Mombasa Ridge. I don't know if Raw did or not, but I think it's likely that somebody was right up there. So the troop of mounted men does not advance in perfect straight line. Sort of light troops skirmishing around, chasing boys and cattle, and they're going to arrive at different points of the landscape at different times, in different order, that we can never know. So that's how I would interpret that, if I can attempt to talk.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, just like we talked about in the earlier points, is that I guess to be able to place everything in exactly like you mentioned, the fact that a troop of mounted men don't advance in a straight line, but often we want them to, so that it makes sense and to what our picture of what we anticipate the operation looked like. But there's all these little things that round the edges that we create the gray areas that we just never know. So as you mentioned, was it one of a section of the troop that happened to be in advance slightly, and they were the ones, and with the remainder of the troop arriving later? Those kinds of small little things, it's just impossible to know. And I think that as you're discussing them, it's a very important part of these little minute pieces of the history of the unknown that I guess it's part of the fabric of the battle, really, because there's huge pieces that are missing, but there's also lots of little things that I don't guess, maybe especially in the internet, that the rabbit holes are all there, and if you want to go down them, they go a long way, some of them, right?
Go for it. I mean, there's 1,000 rabbit holes, but it doesn't get you anywhere.
That's the point, right? As most rabbit holes don't get you anywhere, unless they're in Wonderland somewhere.
I think it's, and this is why I'm a big fan of what you do. In order to understand the battle, or to understand military history generally, and certainly to write about it, you have to know the tactics as well as the officers and soldiers of the period. You can't bring a battle to life unless you understand what those officers and soldiers are thinking. I think tactical history, if you will. I think that's really, really important, and that's, as I say, why I really appreciate and like what you do, because I think you bring that to life for a great many people in a way that mere wordsmiths like me make very laborious. But we do our best. Understanding the tactics is essential. At that point, I think we've made could be a section could be is well made. I get it. I don't know if anybody else does.
Well, the part of the presentation that about this battle in particular that I put on the channel, that's a particular interest to me as the things that you've mentioned there, and to try and take the time to explain some of the details. I think it creates that picture that I guess I mean reading does to a degree, especially. Well, the way that you've written, you've included some of that stuff, but there's a lot of authors that don't, and they just talk about the general movements or the general positions, but then they examined exactly, well, they were all trained. They all have a foundation of knowledge that they're going to at least start with. And if they do need to make amendments to their procedures or whatever, then for sure they will. But, they're not just going to wander out into a field and sort of shake out into some sort of formation. They're going to march there. They're going to respond to words of command. They're going to do that kind of stuff. And they're going to fight in a way that they've been trained to fight.
They have a doctrine. I mean,
exactly.
In the army, we define doctrine very simply. Doctrine is that which is taught. And these guys were all taught ad infinitum,
right.
Repetitive type of training.
Mm-hmm.
So, to some extent, what they do is going to be predictable. In fact, to a greater extent, it's predictable then than perhaps it would be now, which is to our advantage as historians. If you understand the doctrine, their doctrine, but if you don't, then you're going to fall into these rabbit holes. Well, this could be the case, or that could be the case. When in fact, there's a 90% probability that it's not the case, because they just wouldn't have done that.
Right.
It's not the way they thought. It's not the way they operate.
Right.
But you have to understand the regulations, the drill books, the psychology, the mentality of that army, the doctrine, that which is taught.
Mm-hmm. So this brings us to the end of part 1 of our discussion with Colonel Mike Snook. In part 2, we'll discuss British deployments, participants in the firing line, the circumstances of the withdrawal, the endgame and the flight of the fugitives, and details concerning the ammunition supply during the battle. For all your Snyder or Martini reloading needs, talk to Martin at X-Ring Services. If you'd like to support the channel, please stop by our Patreon page. The link is in the description below. And for more information on projects and updates between videos, follow us on our Facebook page.